Sometimes the smallest decision ruins the life you planned, and gives you the life you were meant to have. Snow drifted across downtown Chicago in thick white sheets, softening the sharp glow of traffic lights and turning the sidewalks into slippery rivers of gray slush. The city sounded different in weather like this. Quieter. Colder. Every passing car hissed against wet pavement, while icy wind curled between skyscrapers like something alive. Sophie Bennett tightened the thin wool coat around her body and hurried down the crowded sidewalk, her boots splashing through half-frozen puddles as she checked the time on her cracked phone screen again. 8:13 a.m. Her interview started at 8:30 sharp. Her stomach twisted so hard it almost hurt. She couldn't be late. Not today. Not after 4 months of rejection emails, unanswered applications, and awkward smiles from hiring managers who said things like, "We'll keep your resume on file." She had heard that sentence so many times it no longer sounded real. The freezing wind whipped strands of blonde hair across her face as she stopped beneath the awning outside the train station entrance. Around her, commuters rushed forward with coffee cups in hand and eyes glued to their phones, every person moving like their own problems mattered more than the stranger standing beside them. Maybe they did. Sophie pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse one more time. Bennett and Rowe Financial Consulting. Junior Administrative Coordinator. Starting salary, $62,000 a year plus benefits. Health insurance. Dental. A future. She stared at the address printed across the top and swallowed hard. Her mother's medication alone cost almost $900 a month now. Rent was overdue again. The electricity company had already sent 2 warning notices. This interview wasn't just important. It was survival. "Please," she whispered quietly to herself. "Just let this work." The station doors slid open with a blast of warm air and noise. Sophie hurried inside, the smell of wet coats and burnt coffee instantly wrapping around her. The departure board flickered overhead while announcements echoed through the terminal. She moved quickly through the crowd, clutching her purse tightly against her side. Platform 4. 3 minutes until departure. Her heartbeat pounded harder. She could still make it. Then she heard it. A crash. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just sudden enough to cut through the noise around her. Sophie turned instinctively. About 20 feet away near a row of metal benches, an older man had collapsed awkwardly onto the station floor. A black duffel bag rolled from his shoulder while papers scattered beside him like fallen leaves. People slowed down for half a second, then kept walking. One businessman glanced over his shoulder before stepping around the man entirely. A woman pulling a rolling suitcase frowned briefly and continued toward her train. Nobody stopped. Sophie froze. The overhead speaker crackled again. "Final boarding for the 8:16 express line." Her train. She looked toward platform 4. Then back at the man. He tried pushing himself upright but winced immediately, one hand gripping the edge of the bench. Even from where she stood, Sophie could see blood smeared across his knuckles, bright red against pale skin. Her chest tightened. "Don't do this," her brain warned instantly. "You cannot miss this interview. Not for a stranger. Not today." The train doors would close in less than 2 minutes. Her entire future sat on the other side of those tracks. The man lowered his head slightly, breathing unevenly. Nobody moved toward him. Not one person. Sophie stared at the platform entrance again. Then she thought about her mother sitting in their tiny apartment wrapped in blankets because they barely used the heater anymore. She thought about the unpaid pharmacy bill sitting on the kitchen counter. She thought about all the nights she had promised herself things would get better if she just kept trying. The train announcement sounded again. "Doors closing." Sophie shut her eyes for one painful second. Then she turned away from the platform completely and rushed toward the man instead. "Sir?" she said breathlessly, kneeling beside him on the cold tile floor. "Hey, can you hear me?" Up close, he looked somewhere in his late 50s or early 60s, though exhaustion made him seem older. Snow clung to the shoulders of his dark coat. His silver hair was damp from the storm outside, and there was something strangely sharp about his features despite how tired he looked. Expensive, maybe? Or maybe that was just the way he carried himself even now. His eyes opened slowly, startlingly blue beneath tired lines. "I'm okay," he muttered immediately, embarrassed. "Just slipped." Sophie glanced at the blood on his hand. "That doesn't look okay." He tried to pull his hand back slightly. "It's nothing." But his voice sounded weak. Sophie grabbed tissues from her purse and gently pressed them against the cut across his palm. "You're freezing," she said quietly. "Do you have someone to call?" He hesitated for half a second too long. "No." Another train announcement echoed somewhere overhead. Sophie looked toward the platform again without meaning to. Gone. She missed it. The realization landed heavily inside her chest. She was officially late now. Probably too late. A sharp wave of panic hit her so hard she almost stood up right there. But then the man looked at her again, confused and apologetic all at once. "You should go," he said softly. "You were in a hurry." Sophie forced a small smile even though her stomach felt sick. "Yeah," she admitted quietly. "I was." Snow swirled violently outside the station windows while paramedics still hadn't arrived. Around them, life continued moving without slowing down for either of them. The man studied her face for a moment, almost like he was trying to understand why she stayed. "Most people would have kept walking," he said. Sophie shrugged gently while pressing the tissues against his bleeding hand again. "Most people are tired." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth for the first time. "And you're not?" Sophie laughed softly under her breath. "I'm exhausted." Something about that answer seemed to affect him more than she expected. His expression shifted slightly. Softer now. Almost sad. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. The station lights reflected across the polished floor while snow continued falling beyond the glass doors outside. Then Sophie noticed his hands shaking harder. "You need urgent care," she said firmly. "Come on." "No," he said immediately. "Too expensive." Sophie almost smiled at that. "Trust me," she whispered. "I know." She stood carefully and helped him to his feet. The man leaned on her arm slightly, reluctant but clearly unsteady. Together they moved slowly through the crowded station, while strangers brushed past them without looking twice. Sophie didn't know it yet, but somewhere deep inside that moment, her entire life had already changed forever. The urgent care clinic sat between a closed pharmacy and a laundromat on the corner of West Monroe Street, its flickering blue sign barely visible through the snowstorm outside. Sophie pushed through the glass doors with the older man leaning carefully against her shoulder, while warm air rushed toward them carrying the sharp smell of antiseptic and burnt coffee. The waiting room was crowded with exhausted faces, crying toddlers, and people staring blankly at muted television screens mounted near the ceiling. A nurse behind the front desk looked up briefly. "Insurance card?" she asked automatically. The man hesitated beside Sophie. "I do not have it with me." The nurse sighed softly, already reaching for paperwork. "Then we will need a $200 deposit before treatment unless this is an emergency." Sophie felt her stomach drop instantly. $200. She barely had enough money left for bus fare this week. The older man straightened slightly. "It is fine," he said quietly. "I should go." But Sophie looked down at his trembling hand again, blood still seeping slowly through the tissues she had wrapped around it at the station. "No," she said firmly before she could stop herself. The nurse waited impatiently while people behind them shifted in line. Sophie opened her purse with freezing fingers. Inside sat exactly one emergency envelope folded beneath her wallet. Interview money. Grocery money. Electricity money. $43 in cash and a nearly maxed-out credit card she had promised herself not to touch again. Her chest tightened painfully. This was insane. Completely insane. "Miss?" the nurse asked again. Sophie swallowed hard and slid the credit card across the counter anyway. "Run whatever you can." The older man looked at her immediately. "No," he said quietly. You have already done enough. Sophie forced a tired smile. Apparently I make terrible financial decisions. For the first time, he laughed softly under his breath. The sound surprised her. It was warm. Genuine. Human. Something about it made him seem less like a stranger. The nurse handed over forms while Sophie helped him sit down beside the window. Snow drifted across the parking lot outside in thick white waves while ambulance lights reflected faintly across the glass. Sophie finally checked her phone again. 8:41 a.m. 21 missed notifications from her mother. 2 emails from collection agencies. 1 automated interview reminder that now felt almost cruel. Her interview had already started 11 minutes ago. She stared at the screen without breathing for a second. Maybe if she left now, maybe if she caught another train, maybe they would still let her explain. But the older man suddenly pressed one hand against his side, eyes closing briefly in discomfort. Sophie lowered the phone immediately. Are you dizzy? She asked. Only old, he answered quietly. She smiled despite herself. That bad? Depends who you ask. Another silence settled between them. Softer now. Less awkward. Sophie noticed his coat up close while he rested against the chair beside her. It looked simple at first glance but expensive in a quiet way. Heavy dark wool. Perfect stitching. The kind of coat people bought once and kept for years. Strange. He did not look homeless exactly. Just tired. Worn down somehow. Like someone who had not slept properly in a long time. What is your name? She asked finally. He looked toward the snow outside before answering. Edward, he said after the smallest pause. Sophie nodded slowly. I am Sophie. Sophie, he repeated carefully, almost like memorizing it. A nurse called his name 10 minutes later and disappeared with him behind the double doors. Sophie remained alone in the waiting room, clutching her purse tightly against her lap. Suddenly exhaustion crashed into her all at once. Her body felt heavy. Her interview outfit no longer looked professional after the snow and slush from the station. The sleeve of her white coat still carried a faint streak of blood near the wrist. She rubbed at it absently, but the stain remained. A woman nearby bounced a crying baby gently while daytime talk shows flickered silently overhead. Somewhere down the hall a printer beeped repeatedly. Sophie checked the time again. 9:02 a.m. She was definitely too late now. Her eyes burned suddenly, but she refused to cry here. Not in front of strangers. Not again. She leaned back slowly and stared toward the ceiling instead. 4 months ago she had still believed things could turn around quickly. 1 interview. 1 lucky break. 1 good week. But life did not change that way anymore. Life chipped away at people slowly. Quietly. Rent notice by rent notice. Rejection email by rejection email. Her mother had once told her that adulthood felt like carrying grocery bags that kept getting heavier no matter how many things you put down. Sophie finally understood what she meant. The double doors opened again nearly 30 minutes later. Edward stepped out with fresh bandages wrapped neatly around his hand. He looked steadier now, though still pale. The doctor handed him discharge papers before nodding politely towards Sophie. Your daughter did the right thing bringing you in. Sophie blinked immediately. Daughter? Edward opened his mouth as if to correct him but stopped. Something unreadable crossed his face instead. Yes, he said quietly. She did. The doctor smiled briefly before walking away. Sophie laughed under her breath. Your daughter? Edward adjusted the cuff of his coat slowly. You seemed kind enough to qualify. She shook her head, smiling despite the knot still sitting in her chest. Then her phone buzzed violently again. "MOM calling." Sophie answered instantly and stepped toward the hallway for privacy. "Mom? Soph?" Her mother's weak voice crackled through the speaker. "Did the interview go okay?" Sophie closed her eyes. For one terrible second she almost lied. "I am still working on it. You sound tired." "I am okay." Her mother coughed softly on the other end. The pharmacy called again about the prescription refill. Of course they did. Sophie pressed fingers against her forehead. I will figure it out. Honey, I said I will figure it out. Silence followed immediately. Sophie regretted her tone the second the words left her mouth. I am sorry, she whispered quickly. I am just stressed. You do not have to carry everything alone. Sophie looked through the hallway window toward the snow-covered streets outside. Yeah, she said quietly, though both of them knew that was not true. When she returned to the waiting room, Edward was standing near the entrance watching the storm outside. Everything all right? He asked gently. Sophie forced another smile automatically. Sure. But he looked at her for a long moment like he knew she was lying. You missed something important today because of me. It is fine. No, he said quietly. It is not. Sophie stared down at the bloodstain on her white sleeve again. Maybe not, she admitted softly. A strange sadness crossed his face then. Genuine sadness. Not pity. Something heavier. Older. People rarely sacrifice opportunity for strangers anymore, he said. Especially when they are struggling themselves. Sophie shrugged lightly, though emotion tightened her throat unexpectedly. Maybe I just hope somebody would do the same for my mom one day. The words hung quietly between them. Outside, snow continued falling across Chicago in endless white waves while cars crawled slowly through icy intersections. Edward looked at her differently after that. Not like someone observing a stranger. More like someone seeing something he had forgotten existed. Then a sleek black SUV rolled silently into the parking lot outside the clinic. Sophie barely noticed it through the storm, but Edward did. His expression changed almost instantly. Controlled now. Guarded. The SUV remained idling near the curb while headlights glowed through the snow. Sophie frowned slightly. Are you waiting for someone? Edward looked toward her again. Something like that. Then he reached into his coat pocket and slowly removed a neatly folded handkerchief embroidered with small silver initials near the corner. E.C. He handed it to her carefully. For the coat, he said softly, nodding toward the bloodstain on her sleeve. Sophie glanced down at the white fabric again. Somehow the stain looked darker now beneath the clinic lights. Permanent. She took the handkerchief slowly. The material felt expensive beneath her fingers. Thank you, she said quietly. Edward smiled faintly. No, Sophie. His eyes held hers for one strange lingering moment. Thank you? The black SUV disappeared into the snowstorm less than 30 seconds after Edward stepped outside the clinic, leaving Sophie standing alone near the entrance with the embroidered handkerchief still folded in her hands. She watched the taillights fade into the white blur of Chicago traffic until they vanished completely. Something about the entire interaction felt strange now. Too polished. Too quiet. The driver had jumped out immediately the moment Edward reached the curb, holding the rear passenger door open with the kind of urgency Sophie usually only saw in movies about politicians or celebrities. Yet Edward himself had looked almost uncomfortable getting inside the vehicle, like he did not belong there any more than she belonged inside the financial district skyscraper where her interview had already ended without her. Sophie looked down at the silver initials stitched into the corner of the handkerchief again. E.C. The fabric was impossibly soft beneath her fingers. Expensive. Elegant. Definitely not something a struggling old man carried around casually. Snowflakes melted slowly against the clinic windows while the parking lot lights flickered overhead. Then her phone buzzed again. 9:37 a.m. A voicemail notification from Bennett and Rowe Financial Consulting. Sophie froze instantly. Hope rushed into her chest so fast it almost hurt. Maybe they still wanted to reschedule. Maybe she still had a chance. She stepped quickly beneath the awning outside and pressed the phone to her ear. Hello, Miss Bennett. This is Heather from Human Resources at Bennett and Rowe. Unfortunately, due to your absence this morning, we have moved forward with another candidate. We appreciate your interest and wish you success in your future endeavors. The message ended. Just like that. Sophie lowered the phone slowly while cold wind pushed snow across the sidewalk around her ankles. Another door closed. Another almost. She laughed once under her breath, but there was no humor in it. Just exhaustion. Her reflection stared back at her faintly through the clinic window. Blonde hair damp from snow. Mascara slightly smudged beneath tired eyes. White coat stained near the sleeve with dried blood that refused to disappear. She suddenly looked exactly how she felt. Worn out. The city moved around her anyway. Cars continued honking. People rushed past with shopping bags and coffee cups. Somewhere across the street a man argued loudly into a Bluetooth headset, while taxis sprayed slush against the curb. Nobody noticed the girl standing beneath the urgent care awning trying very hard not to cry in public. Sophie inhaled shakily and shoved the phone back into her purse. She needed to get home before her mother started worrying again. The train ride to the south side felt longer than usual. Every seat smelled faintly of wet wool and melting snow while exhausted commuters stared blankly through fogged windows. Sophie sat quietly near the back of the train, twisting the embroidered handkerchief between her fingers over and over again. E.C. Who even was that man? Her mind replayed small moments from the morning now that adrenaline had faded. The expensive coat. The black SUV. The strange sadness in his eyes whenever he looked at her. And that pause before giving his name. Edward. It suddenly sounded less believable the more she thought about it. By the time she stepped off the train nearly an hour later, the storm had softened into light drifting snowflakes. Her apartment building stood at the end of the block beside a liquor store and an old laundromat with flickering neon signs in the window. The brick building looked even more tired than usual beneath the gray winter sky. Sophie climbed the stairs slowly to the third floor, already bracing herself for the conversation waiting behind the door. Sure enough, the moment she stepped into the apartment, her mother looked up from the couch immediately. Sophie? Karen Bennett sat wrapped in 2 blankets beside the space heater, her reading glasses low on her nose and a half-finished cup of tea cooling beside her. Even from across the room Sophie could see how pale she looked today. How did it go? There it was. The question Sophie had been dreading all morning. She forced a smile while hanging up her coat carefully so the bloodstain faced the wall. Complicated, she answered quietly. Her mother's expression softened instantly. You missed it? Sophie nodded once. Karen sighed gently, not angry, just tired. Somehow that made it worse. What happened? Sophie dropped her purse onto the kitchen counter and leaned against it heavily. A man collapsed at the station. Nobody was helping him. Her mother stared for a second before speaking again. So you stayed? Yeah. And now? Sophie laughed softly without humor. Now I am officially the dumbest person in Chicago. But Karen shook her head immediately. No. You are your father's daughter. The words hit harder than Sophie expected. Her father had been gone nearly 6 years now, but moments like this still brought him rushing back into the room somehow. A mechanic with rough hands and impossible kindness who used to stop for every stranded driver on snowy roads no matter how late he was running himself. Dad also forgot to pay bills half the time, Sophie muttered quietly. Her mother smiled faintly. That part you definitely inherited from me. Sophie finally laughed for real then, though it lasted only a second before reality settled back over both of them. The apartment heater clicked loudly beside the couch. Outside, wind rattled weakly against the old windows. Karen glanced toward the kitchen counter where unpaid envelopes sat stacked beside prescription bottles. The landlord came by again this morning, she said carefully. Sophie closed her eyes briefly. What did he say? Friday. Of course. 3 days. That was all they had left before another impossible choice arrived. Sophie walked quietly into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator even though she already knew there was almost nothing inside. Half a carton of milk. Eggs. Mustard. Leftover soup. She shut the door slowly. I will figure something out. Karen studied her daughter carefully from the couch. You always say that. Sophie turned away quickly before her mother could see the emotion on her face. Because I have to. Silence settled over the apartment again. Heavy. Familiar. The kind that came from too many months of pretending things were still manageable. Later that evening, Sophie sat alone in the laundromat downstairs watching clothes spin slowly behind scratched glass doors while snow continued falling outside beneath the streetlights. The machines hummed softly around her while tired strangers folded towels and stared at their phones nearby. Her white coat sat draped across her lap now, the bloodstains still faintly visible near the sleeve despite 3 attempts to wash it out. Sophie traced her fingers lightly over the mark. Permanent after all. Beside her, the handkerchief remained folded carefully in her coat pocket. E.C. She still could not stop thinking about those initials. Long day? An older woman asked gently from the next row of machines. Sophie looked up. The woman smiled kindly while folding children's clothes into a basket. You have the face of someone carrying too much. Sophie smiled politely. Is it that obvious? Honey, the woman said softly. Chicago teaches you how to recognize tired people. Sophie glanced back toward the spinning washing machines. I missed the biggest interview of my life today helping a stranger. The woman raised an eyebrow slightly. And would you change it if you could? Sophie opened her mouth immediately. Yes. Obviously yes. But the answer never came out. Instead, she remembered Edward sitting quietly in the clinic chair with snow melting in his silver hair while nobody else stopped to help him. She remembered the relief in his eyes when she stayed. She remembered her father pulling over beside stranded drivers during storms because people should not feel abandoned when they are scared. Sophie looked down at the bloodstain again. I do not know, she admitted quietly. The woman smiled gently like she already understood the answer better than Sophie did herself. Sometimes kindness costs something, she said while lifting her laundry basket. That is why so few people offer it. Then she walked away toward the exit, disappearing into the snowy Chicago night. Sophie remained there alone listening to the dryers hum around her. Somewhere upstairs in their apartment, her mother was probably trying not to worry about rent again. Somewhere downtown, another woman had already taken the job Sophie needed desperately. And somewhere in this enormous freezing city, a mysterious man with silver initials on his handkerchief now knew her name. 3 days later, Chicago woke beneath a sky the color of dirty steel, while icy rain tapped steadily against apartment windows across the south side. Sophie Bennett stood barefoot in the kitchen staring at the final notice taped to their refrigerator with a fading magnet shaped like a sunflower. Past due. The red letters looked harsher this morning somehow. More final. The coffee maker sputtered weakly beside her, struggling through the last scoop of cheap grounds left in the cabinet. Everything in the apartment seemed tired lately. The pipes rattled whenever someone upstairs showered. The heater clicked like it was fighting for survival. Even the walls carried that worn-out silence buildings developed after decades of holding too many people's problems. Sophie rubbed her eyes and checked her phone again. No missed calls. No interview reschedules. No miracles. Just another automated reminder that her credit card payment was overdue. Behind her, the couch creaked softly. You are awake early, Karen said gently. Sophie turned toward her mother and forced a smile. Could not sleep. Karen studied her daughter carefully from beneath her blanket. You were pacing again. Sophie laughed quietly under her breath. I did not realize the floors were reporting back to you now. Mothers notice things. Sophie poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one carefully to her mother before sitting across from her at the tiny kitchen table. Rain streaked slowly down the windows while traffic hissed through wet streets 3 stories below. Neither woman spoke for a minute. They both already knew the math did not work anymore. Rent due Friday. Medication refill overdue. $83 left between them. Sophie finally reached into the pocket of her coat hanging beside the door and pulled out the embroidered handkerchief again. E.C. The silver stitching caught faint morning light from the kitchen window. Her mother frowned slightly. That is new. The man from the station gave it to me. Karen touched the fabric gently. This looks expensive. Exactly. Sophie leaned back in her chair. Nothing about him made sense. She told her mother everything then. The black SUV. The driver waiting outside the clinic. The strange hesitation whenever he answered personal questions. Even the way he looked at her sometimes, like he was trying to remember something he lost years ago. Karen listened quietly while cradling the coffee mug between pale hands. Maybe he was somebody important once, she said softly. Sophie shook her head immediately. No. People do not ride around in cars like that because they used to matter. Her mother smiled faintly. You sound suspicious. I am suspicious. Sophie stared down at the initials again. Who carries monogrammed handkerchiefs anymore? Before Karen could answer, a sudden pounding knock echoed through the apartment. Both women froze instantly. Not because they did not know who it was. Because they did. Sophie stood slowly and crossed the apartment toward the front door while rain hammered harder outside. Another knock came. Louder this time. She opened the door carefully. Mr. Delaney stood in the hallway wearing his usual brown maintenance jacket and carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. He looked uncomfortable already. Morning, Sophie. Morning. He shifted awkwardly. I need to talk to you about the apartment. Sophie's stomach tightened immediately. We just need a little more time. Mr. Delaney sighed heavily. I know you do. But I have given you 6 extra weeks already. Behind Sophie, Karen slowly stood from the couch when she heard the conversation turning serious. Please, Sophie said quietly. My mother has been sick and I lost my interview because… She stopped herself suddenly. None of it mattered. Landlords did not care about stories. Only payments. Mr. Delaney lowered his voice slightly. I am sorry. Truly. But if rent is not paid by tomorrow afternoon, I have to change the locks. Karen closed her eyes briefly behind Sophie. The hallway seemed to grow colder all at once. Sophie nodded slowly because dignity was the only thing she still owned completely. Understood. Mr. Delaney hesitated before handing her a folded envelope. There is information for emergency housing assistance inside. Sophie almost laughed. Emergency housing waitlists in Chicago stretched for months. Sometimes years. Still, she took the envelope politely. Thank you. After he left, the apartment became painfully quiet. Rain tapped steadily against the windows while somewhere down the hallway a television played an old game show too loudly. Sophie leaned against the door with the envelope still in her hands. Tomorrow, Karen whispered softly behind her. Sophie nodded once. Neither woman spoke again for a long time. That afternoon, Sophie walked through downtown Chicago handing out resumes anywhere with a help wanted sign in the window. Coffee shops. Grocery stores. Retail stores already decorated for Valentine's Day despite the freezing weather outside. Most managers barely glanced at her paperwork before offering tired smiles and promises to call if something opens up. One woman at a bakery apologized before Sophie even finished speaking. Corporate froze hiring last week. Another restaurant manager looked at her resume and frowned slightly. You are overqualified for hostess work. Sophie wanted to ask how someone could be both overqualified and unemployed at the same time, but she was too exhausted to argue anymore. By sunset her fingers were numb despite wearing gloves and the inside of her boots had soaked through from icy slush. She stepped into a small diner near Clark Street mostly because the smell of soup drifting through the doorway made her suddenly dizzy with hunger. The diner was nearly empty except for 2 construction workers near the counter, and a young waitress wiping tables beside the windows. Sophie slid into a booth near the back and counted the money left inside her wallet carefully beneath the table. $21. That was all. She ordered the cheapest thing on the menu. Chicken noodle soup and coffee. Steam rose from the bowl a few minutes later while snow mixed with rain outside beneath glowing streetlights. Sophie wrapped both hands around the coffee mug slowly, letting warmth return painfully to her fingers. The waitress glanced toward her white coat draped beside the booth. Rough weather for that color, she joked kindly. Sophie looked down at the faint bloodstains still barely visible near the sleeve. Somehow, even after washing it twice, the mark remained. "You have no idea," Sophie murmured softly. She reached into the coat pocket automatically and touched the folded handkerchief again. See. Her mind kept drifting back to Edward no matter how hard she tried to focus on practical things. Who was he really? Why had he looked almost guilty when she missed her interview? And why had he thanked her like she had done something extraordinary when all she did was stop walking? The bell above the diner entrance jingled suddenly. Cold air rushed inside as a tall man in a dark coat stepped through the doorway carrying snow across polished tile floors. Sophie barely glanced up at first. Then the waitress near the counter straightened immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Cole." Sophie froze. The man nodded politely toward the staff while removing leather gloves. Even from across the diner, there was something commanding about him. Late 30s maybe. Dark hair touched faintly with gray near the temples. Sharp blue eyes. Expensive charcoal coat perfectly tailored despite the weather outside. He looked familiar somehow. Not personally familiar. More like someone she had seen before without realizing where. "Usual table?" the waitress asked warmly. "Please." Sophie looked back down at her soup quickly, suddenly aware of how worn her boots looked beneath the booth. The man walked past her table toward a quiet corner near the windows while speaking softly into his phone. "No. Cancel the board dinner tomorrow night. I want the audit reports first." Sophie stirred the soup absently while trying not to stare. Cole. The name tugged at something in her memory. Downtown billboards maybe. Charity galas. Magazine covers and grocery checkout lines. Then realization hit so suddenly it almost made her drop the spoon. Ethan Cole. Founder of Cole Foundation. Billionaire investor. One of the youngest CEOs in Chicago. Sophie looked toward the corner booth again instinctively. The man sat facing away from her now, shoulders tense while speaking quietly with the waitress. It could not be him. Chicago had millions of people named Cole. Still. Sophie frowned slowly. Same eyes. Same voice. Same impossible feeling that she had seen him very recently somewhere much closer than a magazine cover. Then the waitress returned holding the black check folder for his table. As she passed Sophie's booth, something slipped accidentally from beneath the folder onto the floor. Sophie bent automatically and picked it up before the waitress noticed. A white business card. Thick expensive paper. The silver lettering across the front read only 3 words. Ethan Cole. Below the name sat the same exact initials stitched into the handkerchief still resting inside Sophie's coat pocket. E.C. Sophie stared at the business card in her hand while the sounds of the diner seemed to fade somewhere far into the background. Ethan Cole. The silver lettering looked almost unreal beneath the warm yellow lights above the booth. Her pulse began hammering instantly. Slowly, she reached into the pocket of her white coat and pulled out the folded handkerchief again. E.C. Same initials. Same elegant silver stitching. Her stomach dropped so suddenly she nearly stopped breathing. No way. Her eyes lifted carefully toward the man seated near the window. He was still speaking quietly with the waitress, one hand resting against the coffee mug while snow drifted beyond the glass behind him. The expensive charcoal coat. The calm voice. The blue eyes. Sophie suddenly saw it all clearly now beneath the polished appearance. Edward. The stranger from the train station. Except Edward did not exist. Ethan Cole did. Billionaire CEO. Founder of one of the largest charitable foundations in Illinois. The man financial magazines called Chicago's Quiet King. Sophie looked back down at the card again in disbelief. Why would someone like him pretend to be struggling? Why lie about his name? And why had he looked at her like she mattered? "Miss?" The waitress appeared beside her booth gently. Sophie startled slightly. "Oh. Sorry." She held up the business card awkwardly. "This fell." The waitress smiled immediately. "Thank you?" Sophie hesitated. "That is Ethan Cole?" "Yeah." The waitress lowered her voice slightly, glancing toward his table with obvious admiration. He comes in sometimes after board meetings downtown. Always tips huge. Nicest billionaire you will ever meet. Sophie almost laughed at the sentence. Nicest billionaire. If only the waitress knew she had helped that same billionaire into urgent care while believing he was some exhausted old man stranded in a train station. You okay? The waitress asked carefully. Sophie forced a quick nod. Yeah. I just thought he looked familiar. The waitress grinned. Everyone says that. Then she carried the card back toward Ethan's table. Sophie looked away immediately before he could notice her staring. Her thoughts spiraled wildly now. The black SUV. The expensive handkerchief. The way the clinic staff had mistaken her for family and Ethan had not corrected them. None of it had been accidental. But why? A billionaire pretending to be vulnerable in a train station made no sense. Unless... Sophie suddenly remembered the article she had read months ago about wealthy executives secretly auditing their own charities to expose corruption. Her eyes widened slightly. Was that what this was? Some kind of undercover investigation? The idea sounded ridiculous, yet somehow completely believable at the same time. Across the diner, Ethan stood slowly from his booth while buttoning his coat. The waitress handed back the business card and he slipped it into his wallet without looking down. Then, for one brief second, his eyes lifted across the room. Directly towards Sophie. Time seemed to freeze. Recognition flashed across his face instantly. Not surprise exactly. More like inevitability. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Ethan paused beside the booth near the windows while snow swirled outside behind him. The diner suddenly felt too warm. Too small. Sophie looked down at her soup immediately, panic rushing through her chest. Maybe if she pretended not to recognize him, he would keep walking. Maybe this entire strange moment could disappear. Footsteps approached slowly across the diner floor. Then stopped beside her table. Sophie. His voice sounded different now. Richer somehow. More controlled. Yet unmistakably the same man from the station. Sophie looked up slowly. Ethan Cole stood beside the booth in a perfectly tailored coat worth more than her monthly rent, his blue eyes calm but unreadable beneath the soft diner lights. For a second neither of them spoke. Sophie finally let out a short, disbelieving laugh under her breath. Edward? She asked quietly. One corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Fair. She stared at him. You lied to me. Ethan glanced toward the empty seat across from her. May I? Sophie should have said no. Absolutely no. But instead she nodded once before she could stop herself. Ethan sat carefully across from her booth while the waitress immediately appeared with fresh coffee for him without asking. He thanked her quietly before looking back at Sophie again. I owe you an explanation. Sophie folded her arms tightly. You think? Ethan accepted the reaction calmly. My real name is Ethan Cole. I figured that part out. He almost smiled at that. Almost. I was conducting an independent review of several outreach programs connected to my foundation. Sophie frowned slightly. By pretending to be homeless? By trying to understand how people are treated when they appear powerless. Sophie leaned back slowly, studying him. That is insane. Ethan nodded once. Probably. Outside the diner windows, snow continued drifting beneath glowing streetlights while cars crawled slowly through evening traffic. The construction workers near the counter laughed loudly about something on television, completely unaware that one of the richest men in Chicago sat quietly inside the corner booth beside them. Sophie shook her head slowly. You let me spend my last money helping you. For the first time since sitting down, something painful crossed Ethan's face. Real guilt. I did not know it was your last money. Sophie looked away toward the window. Still. Silence settled briefly between them while steam curled upward from untouched coffee cups. Ethan finally spoke again, quieter now. You stopped when nobody else did. Sophie laughed softly without humor. Congratulations. Humanity passed one test, No, Ethan said gently. Humanity failed. You did not. The words landed harder than she expected. Sophie stared down at the bloodstains still faintly visible near her coat sleeve. That interview was important. I know. I lost it. Ethan nodded slowly. I know that too. Sophie looked back at him sharply. How? Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. There it was again. That carefulness. That feeling he knew more than he should. I asked someone to confirm whether they rescheduled your appointment, he admitted quietly. Sophie blinked. You investigated me? No. He paused. I worried about you. The honesty in his voice caught her completely off guard. Ethan did not sound defensive or arrogant. Just sincere. Exhausted, even. Sophie suddenly noticed small details she missed before. The faint shadows beneath his eyes. The tension in his shoulders. The way he seemed constantly alert despite speaking softly. He looked less like a billionaire now and more like a man carrying too many responsibilities alone. Why? She asked quietly. Ethan looked toward the snowy street outside before answering. Because people usually want something from me the moment they recognize my face. His voice remained calm, but something lonely hid underneath it. You were the first person in a long time who treated me like I mattered before knowing who I was. Sophie's chest tightened unexpectedly. She did not know what to say to that. Ethan reached into his coat pocket slowly and placed a business card carefully on the table between them. Not the polished public version this time. Simpler. Private. A direct number handwritten across the back in dark ink. If you are willing, he said quietly, I would like the chance to repay your kindness properly. Sophie looked down at the card without touching it. I am not looking for charity. I know. Then what exactly are you offering? Ethan studied her for a long moment. An opportunity. Sophie almost laughed again because rich people always called things opportunities when they really meant power. Yet something about Ethan felt different from the executives she imagined behind glass skyscraper windows downtown. There was no performance in his voice. No fake charm. Just sincerity wrapped tightly around exhaustion. Before Sophie could answer, her phone buzzed violently against the table. Unknown number. She frowned slightly and answered. Hello? A cold male voice responded immediately. Miss Bennett, this is building management. Since rent has not been received by the deadline, access to your apartment will be restricted tomorrow at noon. Sophie's face drained of color instantly. Ethan watched her expression change but said nothing. Please, Sophie whispered quickly into the phone. We just need another week. I am sorry. The decision is final. The line disconnected. Sophie lowered the phone slowly while humiliation burned hot across her face. She suddenly became painfully aware of everything Ethan could probably see now. The worn coat. The exhaustion. The panic she tried so hard to hide. Silence settled between them again, while snow drifted outside beneath the city lights. Then Ethan reached quietly across the table and slid the untouched bowl of soup slightly closer toward her because he noticed she had barely eaten all evening. Such a small gesture. Gentle. Careful. Human. Sophie looked at him differently after that. Sophie barely touched the rest of her soup after the call ended. The diner suddenly felt too bright, too crowded, too small to hold the humiliation pressing against her chest. Tomorrow at noon. That was it. The final deadline. Her apartment. Her mother's medicine. Everything hanging by a thread so thin she could almost hear it snapping. Across from her, Ethan remained quiet for several seconds, his hands resting loosely around the untouched coffee cup in front of him. Most wealthy men Sophie imagined would rush to fix the problem immediately, throwing money at it like a performance. But Ethan did not move. He simply watched her carefully, like he understood pride could break just as easily as poverty. Finally he spoke softly. How much? Sophie looked up immediately. No, Sophie. I said no. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. The construction workers near the counter glanced over briefly before returning to their conversation. Sophie lowered her voice and rubbed tired fingers against her forehead. I appreciate what you are trying to do. Really. But I am not taking money from a billionaire because I helped him one morning. Ethan nodded once, calm as ever. What if it is not charity? Sophie almost laughed. Everything feels like charity when you are desperate. That answer seemed to hit him harder than she expected. Something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe? Like he understood desperation better than someone with his bank account should. Outside the diner windows, snow mixed with freezing rain beneath the streetlights while taxis crawled slowly through downtown traffic. Ethan leaned back slightly in the booth, studying her. Do you know what people usually ask me for when they realize who I am? Sophie folded her arms tightly. Probably yachts and private islands. One corner of his mouth lifted faintly. Mostly investments. Favors. Access. His expression dimmed again almost immediately. Nobody ever asks if I am tired. Sophie frowned slightly. That was not the answer she expected. Ethan glanced toward the window before continuing quietly. I built Cole Foundation because my father believed wealth should leave fingerprints on the world after you are gone. Sophie listened despite herself. Your father started the company? Ethan shook his head once. My father was a public school teacher. That surprised her enough to silence every assumption she had built around him. Ethan looked nothing like the sons of privilege she imagined inheriting skyscrapers and trust funds. When he got sick, Ethan continued quietly, we lost almost everything paying medical bills. Sophie stared at him now. You! Turns out hospitals do not care how hard someone works. His voice remained calm, but something painful lingered beneath it. I remember watching my mother choose between groceries and prescriptions. Sophie's chest tightened slowly. Suddenly his interest in her made more sense. Ethan understood the language of overdue bills and impossible choices because he had spoken it once too. So you became a billionaire? She asked softly. Ethan gave a quiet breath that almost sounded like laughter. That part took longer. Silence settled briefly between them again, softer this time. Less defensive. Sophie realized she no longer saw him only as a billionaire sitting across from her in a designer coat. She saw exhaustion now. Loneliness. A man who probably spent most days surrounded by people yet somehow trusted almost nobody. Ethan reached into his coat pocket slowly and pulled out a slim black card holder. Sophie tensed immediately. He noticed. Not money, he said gently. Then he slid a business card across the table toward her. Not the private number from earlier. This one carried the Silver Cole Foundation logo beneath his name. Come by tomorrow morning. Sophie frowned slightly. Why? Because I would like to offer you a job. She stared at him in disbelief. You do not even know me. Actually, Ethan said quietly, I know more about your character than most employers ever will. Sophie looked down at the card. Director's assistant. Community Outreach Division. Her pulse quickened slightly despite herself. I do not have nonprofit experience. You have empathy. That is not a resume qualification. Ethan's expression softened faintly. Maybe it should be. Sophie hated that part of her wanted to believe him. Hated how tempting stability suddenly sounded after months of fear and rejection. But another part of her remained cautious. Proud. And what exactly would I do? She asked carefully. Ethan folded his hands loosely together. Help oversee community programs connected to our emergency housing initiative. Sophie blinked once. Emergency housing. The irony almost hurt. Ethan continued. The position pays $70,000 a year. Full benefits. Flexible scheduling if your mother requires care. Sophie stared at him speechlessly. The number sounded unreal inside a diner where she counted quarters before ordering soup. Ethan noticed the hesitation still written across her face. It is not pity, he said quietly. You are observant, calm under pressure, compassionate, and stubborn enough to argue with a billionaire in public. Those qualities are surprisingly rare. Sophie let out a short breath of disbelief. You make it sound very flattering. I am trying. For the first time all evening, she smiled slightly. Genuine this time. Small, but real. Ethan looked almost surprised by it. Then his phone buzzed sharply against the table, breaking the moment instantly. Ethan glanced at the screen and his expression tightened. Business again. Responsibility settling back onto his shoulders like armor. He answered quietly. What happened? Sophie looked away politely while he listened. His jaw hardened almost immediately. No. Freeze all outgoing transfers until I review the numbers myself. A pause. I do not care what the board approved. Sophie pretended to focus on her coffee while Ethan continued speaking in low controlled tones about audits, missing funds, and internal reports. Whatever problem waited for him outside this diner sounded serious. Yet somehow, sitting here beside melting snow and chipped coffee mugs, he still seemed more present with her than half the people in her own life. After ending the call, Ethan rubbed tired fingers briefly against his temple. Sophie studied him carefully. You really are investigating your own foundation. Ethan looked mildly surprised. How did you figure that out? You have the face of someone who trusts spreadsheets less than people right now. A quiet laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Warm. Genuine. Sophie realized suddenly she liked hearing that sound. Dangerous thought. Very dangerous. She looked down quickly at her coffee again. Ethan stood slowly from the booth and buttoned his coat. You should think about the offer. Sophie glanced up. And if I say no? Then I will respect that. He paused briefly. But I hope you do not. Outside, the storm had finally begun calming into soft drifting snow again. Ethan placed enough cash beneath the check holder to cover both meals before stepping away from the table. Then he stopped and looked back at her one last time. Tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. Sophie stared down at the business card still resting beside her coffee cup. Why me? She asked quietly. Ethan held her gaze for several long seconds before answering. Because when everyone else kept walking, you did not. Then he turned and walked toward the diner entrance. The bell above the door jingled softly as cold air swept briefly inside. Sophie watched through the window while the black SUV pulled silently to the curb outside. The driver stepped out immediately to open the rear passenger door, but before getting inside, Ethan glanced back once through the snowy glass toward her booth. Something passed across his expression then. Not attraction exactly. Not yet. Recognition, maybe? Like he saw part of himself reflected in someone he never expected to meet. The SUV disappeared into downtown traffic moments later, leaving Sophie alone again with melting snow outside the windows and a life-changing business card sitting quietly beside her coffee cup. Back at the apartment later that night, Karen listened carefully while Sophie explained everything. The billionaire. The diner. The job offer. By the end, her mother simply stared at her in disbelief from the couch. You are telling me the homeless man from the train station is one of the richest people in Chicago? Sophie dropped onto the chair beside the kitchen table heavily. Apparently. Karen looked toward the business card in Sophie's hands. And he offered you $70,000 a year? Apparently. Her mother smiled faintly. Your father would have called this divine intervention. Sophie shook her head slowly. Or manipulation. Do you think he is dangerous? Sophie thought about Ethan sliding the soup bowl closer because he noticed she had not eaten. The guilt in his eyes when she mentioned losing the interview. The exhaustion hiding behind his calm voice whenever business interrupted him. No, she admitted softly. I think he is lonely. The apartment fell quiet again while snow drifted gently outside beyond the old windows. Tomorrow at noon they would lose their home unless something changed. And for the first time in months, change had finally knocked on Sophie Bennett's door wearing a charcoal coat and carrying the initials E.C. The next morning, Sophie woke before sunrise to the sound of pipes groaning somewhere inside the apartment walls and freezing wind rattling weakly against the windows. For a few disoriented seconds, she forgot everything. The overdue rent. The eviction notice. Ethan Cole sitting across from her in a diner booth offering a life that sounded too good to be real. Then reality settled back over her chest all at once. Her eyes moved toward the business card resting carefully beside the alarm clock. Cole Foundation. The silver lettering caught pale morning light leaking through the curtains. Sophie stared at it while lying perfectly still beneath the blankets. Part of her wanted to throw the card away immediately. Another part could not stop thinking about what $70,000 a year would mean. Her mother could refill prescriptions without panic. They could keep the apartment. Maybe even move somewhere with windows that did not leak cold air every winter. Stability. The word itself felt dangerous now. "You are thinking too loudly again," Karen murmured sleepily from the couch in the other room. Sophie smiled faintly despite herself and sat up slowly. "Sorry." "No, you are not." Sophie walked quietly into the kitchen wearing thick socks and an old sweater while the coffee maker sputtered weakly to life again. Outside, Chicago still looked wrapped in gray winter exhaustion. Snow covered parked cars in uneven layers while early commuters moved through icy sidewalks carrying briefcases and paper coffee cups. Everyone looked tired this time of year. Like the city itself demanded endurance as rent payment for existing here. Karen sat beneath the blanket on the couch watching Sophie carefully over the rim of her tea mug. "You are going." Sophie poured coffee into two mismatched mugs. "I did not say that. You did not have to." Sophie handed her mother a cup before leaning against the kitchen counter. "What if this whole thing is a mistake?" Karen raised an eyebrow gently. "Helping someone rarely is. I mean him." Sophie looked toward the business card again. "People like Ethan Cole do not randomly walk into struggling strangers' lives." Her mother smiled softly. "Neither do miracles." Sophie laughed quietly under her breath. "That sounds suspiciously like optimism. I raised you. I had to become good at it." Silence settled briefly between them while steam rose from coffee cups in the cold apartment. Then Karen spoke again, quieter now. "You have spent months apologizing for surviving, Sophie." Sophie frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "Every opportunity feels selfish to you because your father spent his life putting everyone else first." Karen looked down into her tea. "But kindness should not require self-destruction." Sophie swallowed slowly. Her mother rarely spoke about her father in that tone. Honest. Heavy. "Dad would have helped him too," Sophie whispered. "Yes," Karen agreed softly. "But your father also wanted more for you than exhaustion." The words stayed with Sophie long after she left the apartment an hour later. Downtown Chicago looked polished and untouchable beneath the pale winter sky while black cars glided between towering glass buildings that reflected clouds like mirrors. Sophie stepped carefully through the revolving doors of Cole Foundation headquarters, clutching her coat tighter around herself. The lobby alone looked larger than her entire apartment building. White marble floors stretched beneath modern chandeliers while quiet instrumental music floated through hidden speakers overhead. Employees in tailored suits moved efficiently through security gates carrying sleek laptops and expensive coffee. Sophie suddenly became painfully aware of her scuffed boots and thrift store coat. She did not belong here. A sharply dressed receptionist looked up immediately from the front desk. "Good morning. Welcome to Cole Foundation." Sophie cleared her throat softly. "I have an appointment with Mr. Cole." The receptionist's professional smile shifted slightly. Respectful now. "Your name?" "Sophie Bennett." The woman typed something quickly into her computer before nodding. "Mr. Cole is expecting you." Of course he was. Sophie followed another employee toward the elevators while trying not to stare openly at everything around her. Massive abstract paintings lined the walls. Fresh white flowers sat arranged near floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Even the air smelled expensive somehow. Clean. Sophisticated. Controlled. Nothing like the laundromat downstairs from her apartment, that always smelled faintly of detergent and exhaustion. The elevator climbed silently toward the top floors while Sophie watched the city shrink beneath her through glass walls. Her stomach twisted tighter with every passing second. What exactly was she doing here? The elevator doors finally opened onto a quiet executive floor lined with dark wood walls and soft lighting. The employee guided her toward a large office at the end of the hallway before stepping away politely. Sophie hesitated outside the closed door for half a second. Then a familiar voice called from inside. "Come in." Ethan stood near the windows overlooking the city skyline, one hand tucked into the pocket of a charcoal suit, while the other held a tablet filled with financial reports. Morning light poured across the office behind him, illuminating shelves lined with books and framed photographs. He looked completely different here than he had in the diner. More controlled. More powerful. Yet somehow also more tired. Ethan glanced up the moment she entered. "You came." Sophie folded her arms lightly. "I almost did not." One corner of his mouth lifted faintly. "That sounds honest. It usually gets me into trouble." Ethan gestured toward the seating area beside the windows. "Coffee? Please." While he poured coffee from a silver carafe nearby, Sophie studied the office carefully. No gold statues. No flashy displays of wealth. Just quiet elegance. Framed photographs caught her attention most. Community centers. Volunteers. Children holding donated winter coats. Ethan in rolled-up sleeves carrying boxes beside shelter workers. The pictures looked genuine. Unposed. Ethan noticed her staring. "My communications team hates those photos." Sophie glanced toward him. "Why?" "Because none of them look expensive enough." She laughed softly before she could stop herself. Ethan looked strangely pleased hearing it. He handed her a coffee mug before sitting across from her near the windows. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked gently. Sophie wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "Not really." "Because of the job?" "Because my landlord changes the locks at noon." Ethan's expression dimmed slightly. "Sophie, do not." She looked at him carefully. "If I take this job, it cannot be because you feel guilty." Ethan held her gaze steadily. "I offered the position before I knew your deadline." That was true. Sophie hated that it mattered. Ethan set his coffee down slowly. "Would you like complete honesty?" "Probably." "You intrigue me." The answer caught her completely off guard. Ethan continued before she could respond. "Not romantically." A faint, almost smile touched his expression. "At least not yet." "I mean psychologically." Sophie blinked once in disbelief. "That is somehow both flattering and concerning." Ethan actually laughed softly this time. Warmer than before. "Most people panic around power. You challenge it." Sophie leaned back slightly. "Maybe because I have nothing left to lose." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Ethan's expression changed immediately. Softer now. More personal. "That feeling can make people dangerous," he said quietly. "Or brave." Silence settled between them while snow drifted slowly beyond the massive windows overlooking Chicago. Then Ethan reached across the table and slid a thin folder toward her. Sophie opened it carefully. Employment contract. Salary details. Healthcare coverage. Emergency housing assistance benefits connected to employee relocation services. Her pulse quickened slightly. It all looked real. Too real. "There is one thing you should know before deciding," Ethan said quietly. Sophie looked up. "What?" Ethan leaned back slowly, exhaustion returning faintly to his face. "Something is wrong inside my foundation." The warmth in the room suddenly seemed to cool. Sophie looked at Ethan carefully across the quiet office while snow drifted beyond the towering windows behind him. The warmth from the coffee cup faded slowly between her hands as his words settled heavily into the room. "Something is wrong inside my foundation." For a second she forgot about the eviction notice waiting at noon. Forgot about overdue bills and broken heaters and every desperate thing chasing her these past few months. Ethan did not sound like a billionaire discussing a business inconvenience. He sounded like a man watching something important rot from the inside. What kind of wrong? She asked quietly. Ethan leaned back slowly in the chair, his jaw tightening slightly. Money is disappearing. Sophie blinked once. From the charity programs? He nodded. Small amounts at first. At least small enough to hide inside a budget this large. He reached toward the tablet resting beside him and turned the screen around. Spreadsheets filled the display. Donation transfers. Outreach grants. Housing initiatives. Numbers Sophie barely understood. Ethan pointed calmly toward several highlighted sections. Funds approved for emergency shelters never arrived. His finger moved lower across the screen. Medical assistance reimbursements processed twice under different names. Another section. Food distribution invoices inflated nearly 40%. Sophie frowned deeper the longer she looked. How much money are we talking about? Ethan's expression darkened faintly. Enough to feed thousands of families through winter. The answer made her stomach twist. Outside the office windows, Chicago stretched endlessly beneath gray skies while people hurried through frozen sidewalks completely unaware that one of the city's largest charities might be quietly failing the very people it promised to protect. Sophie looked back toward Ethan. And nobody noticed? Ethan gave a tired breath through his nose. People notice what they expect to notice. He stood slowly and walked toward the windows overlooking downtown. Most board members see reports. Publicity. Tax numbers. His reflection stared back at him faintly through the glass. I started seeing exhaustion. Sophie watched him carefully now. The controlled billionaire image from the diner had faded again. This version of Ethan looked more human somehow. More burdened. That is why you were undercover, she realized softly. Ethan nodded once. I wanted to see the programs myself without anyone preparing for my arrival. Sophie remembered him sitting on the cold station floor with blood on his hand while strangers walked around him without stopping. And what did you find? Ethan's eyes stayed on the city below. Most people inside the foundation are good. He paused briefly. But somewhere between executive offices and street-level outreach, compassion becomes paperwork. Silence settled heavily between them. Sophie looked down at the employment folder resting in front of her. Why are you telling me this? Ethan finally turned back toward her. Because you understand the people these programs are supposed to help. Sophie almost laughed softly. You mean poor people? I mean invisible people. The honesty in his voice caught her completely off guard again. Ethan stepped closer toward the table, resting one hand lightly against the chair across from her. You notice things others ignore. Sophie folded her arms slightly. You figured that out from one morning at a train station? No. Ethan's expression softened faintly. From the way you watched everyone else walk away before deciding not to. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. Nobody had ever described her like that before. Observant. Brave. Worth noticing. Most days Sophie felt more like background noise inside a city too busy surviving itself to care who fell behind. Ethan slid another document across the table toward her. Employee housing authorization forms. Her eyes widened slightly. You already approved relocation? Ethan looked almost uncomfortable now. Only temporarily. Until you decide. Sophie stared at the forms carefully. A furnished apartment near downtown. 6-month housing support through the Foundation's relocation initiative. The address alone probably cost more per month than she had earned all year. This is insane, she whispered. Ethan rested both hands loosely in his pockets. No. What is insane is a city where teachers, nurses, and caregivers work full-time while sleeping in shelters. Sophie looked up sharply. You really believe that? I lived it. The room grew quiet again. Ethan rarely raised his voice, but every time he spoke about struggle, Sophie heard something painfully real underneath it. Not performance. Memory. Before she could answer, a sharp knock interrupted the moment. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Controlled again. Professional. Come in. A tall woman in a navy suit stepped inside carrying a digital tablet against her chest. Early 40s maybe. Precise posture. Sharp eyes. "Sorry to interrupt," she said politely before noticing Sophie. "Oh." Ethan nodded calmly. "Claire, this is Sophie Bennett." Claire's gaze moved quickly between them with obvious curiosity before offering a professional smile. "Nice to meet you." Sophie stood awkwardly and shook her hand. Claire turned back toward Ethan immediately. "The board moved the finance review meeting to 11. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "Of course they did." Claire lowered her voice slightly. "Marcus Hill is pushing hard for approval before audit reports finalize." Sophie noticed the shift in Ethan immediately at the mention of the name. Not fear. Frustration. "Delay it," Ethan said calmly. "I want every transfer reviewed first." Claire hesitated carefully. "You know they will resist that." Ethan's expression hardened. "Then let them." Claire nodded once before glancing towards Sophie again. Something unreadable flickered across her face. Concern, maybe. Or warning. "I will reschedule the conference room." After she left, silence lingered for a second. Sophie studied Ethan carefully. "Marcus Hill?" Ethan walked back toward the windows slowly. "Chief Financial Officer. And you think he is involved?" Ethan shook his head slightly. "I think someone inside the executive structure knows exactly where the money is going." Sophie frowned. "That sounds dangerous." Ethan looked back at her with a tired half-smile. "You spent your last money helping a stranger in a train station. I think your definition of dangerous is flexible." Sophie should have smiled back. Instead, her phone buzzed violently inside her coat pocket. The sound cut through the office like an alarm. Her stomach dropped immediately before she even checked the screen. "Building management." "Noon." Sophie answered quickly. "Hello? Miss Bennett, this is a reminder that lock changes are scheduled today at 12 o'clock if payment is not received." Sophie closed her eyes briefly. "I understand. We also need the unit cleared by 6 p.m. The line disconnected before she could respond. Humiliation burned hot across her face instantly. She hated that Ethan overheard every word. Hated how exposed her life suddenly felt inside this polished office overlooking downtown Chicago. Sophie stood quickly and gathered the employment folder with trembling fingers. "I should go." Ethan stepped forward immediately. "Sophie. I need to handle this." "You should not handle it alone." The word stopped her for half a second. Ethan's voice remained calm, but there was something deeper underneath it now. Concern. Genuine concern. Sophie looked at him carefully. "Why do you care this much?" Ethan hesitated. Not because he lacked an answer. Because he had too many. Finally he spoke quietly. "Because when I was 19, my mother and I lost our apartment 3 days before Christmas." Sophie stared at him silently. Ethan looked past her briefly toward the snowy city beyond the windows. "A church shelter took us in for 2 weeks." His voice remained steady, but his eyes changed. Older suddenly. "I still remember how embarrassed my mother looked carrying trash bags full of clothes through downtown." Sophie's chest tightened painfully. Ethan met her gaze again. "People saved us when they did not have to." The office felt impossibly quiet after that. Sophie slowly looked back down at the housing paperwork in her hands. Temporary apartment. Benefits. Stability. Hope. All the things she stopped allowing herself to imagine because disappointment hurt less when you expected nothing. Ethan stepped closer carefully, like approaching something fragile. "Take the job," he said softly. "Not because you owe me anything. Because your life matters too." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, while snow drifted silently outside the windows behind him. Then, very slowly, she signed the employment papers with shaking hands. By 6 o'clock that evening, Sophie stood inside a furnished apartment 22 floors above downtown Chicago, staring at lights stretching endlessly across the winter skyline. Snow drifted softly between skyscrapers while traffic glowed below like rivers of gold moving through darkness. The silence inside the apartment felt unreal. No rattling pipes. No flickering heaters. No neighbors screaming through thin walls at midnight. Just warmth. Stillness. Safety. Her mother sat carefully on the edge of the gray sectional couch nearby, wrapped in disbelief almost as much as the blanket around her shoulders. "This place has 2 bathrooms," Karen whispered like she still could not trust her own eyes. Sophie laughed softly under her breath while setting down another cardboard moving box beside the kitchen island. "Apparently rich people enjoy options." Karen smiled faintly, but emotion quickly softened her expression. "Sophie." Sophie looked toward her mother immediately. "What?" Karen's eyes moved slowly around the apartment again. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Stainless steel appliances. Fresh flowers already waiting on the dining table beside a handwritten welcome note from the relocation department. "You saved us." The words landed heavily in Sophie's chest. She leaned against the counter quietly, suddenly overwhelmed by how quickly life had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday morning she was counting grocery money in a freezing apartment, while preparing to lose everything. Tonight she stood inside a luxury downtown apartment because she stopped to help a bleeding stranger at a train station. Nothing about it felt normal. Her phone buzzed softly against the kitchen counter. "Ethan." Sophie stared at the screen for half a second before answering. "Hello? Did you get settled in all right?" His voice sounded lower tonight. Tired. Sophie walked quietly toward the windows overlooking the city while her mother pretended not to listen from the couch. "Yeah," she answered softly. "My mother thinks the bathroom is emotionally overwhelming." Ethan laughed quietly on the other end of the call. Warm enough to make something flutter unexpectedly inside her chest. "That is usually how people react to the heated floors." Sophie blinked once. "The floors are heated? You just discovered them, did you not?" She slipped off one shoe cautiously and pressed her socked foot against the hardwood. "Warm." Sophie stared downward in disbelief. "That feels unnecessary." "Chicago winters disagree." She smiled despite herself. Silence settled briefly between them while city lights shimmered beyond the glass. "Thank you," Sophie said finally. The words came quieter than she expected. More vulnerable. Ethan did not answer immediately. "You do not owe me gratitude for basic dignity," he said gently. Her chest tightened again. Nobody had ever framed help that way before. Not as charity. Not as pity. Dignity. "Still," she whispered. Ethan's voice softened further. "How is your mother?" Sophie looked back toward Karen sitting peacefully on the couch for the first time in months without fear written across her face. "She smiled today." Ethan grew quiet for a second. "Good." Something about the way he said it felt deeply personal. Like her mother's relief mattered to him more than it should. Sophie leaned lightly against the cold glass window. "Do you ever stop working?" she asked suddenly. Ethan gave a quiet breath through the phone. "Not often." "You sound exhausted." "That makes 2 of us." She smiled faintly again before glancing toward the clock on the wall. Nearly 7:30. "You are still at the office?" "Unfortunately." Papers shuffled softly somewhere on his end of the line. "The finance review meeting became unpleasant." Sophie frowned slightly. "Because of the missing money?" "Because people become defensive when transparency enters the room." She could almost picture him now. Sleeves rolled slightly. Jaw tense. Blue eyes fixed on spreadsheets while executives argued around polished conference tables. "Marcus Hill?" she asked carefully. Ethan was quiet for half a beat. "You notice details quickly." "You said that already?" Another soft laugh. "Yes." Marcus pushed aggressively to finalize next quarter budgets before the audit completed. Sophie's expression dimmed slightly. "That sounds suspicious." "It sounds rushed." Ethan paused briefly. "And rushing around missing money is rarely accidental." Sophie watched snow drifting outside the windows while unease slowly settled into her stomach. "Why not just fire him?" "Because accusations without proof destroy organizations." Ethan's tone became more controlled now. More CEO than man. If corruption exists inside the foundation, I need evidence strong enough to survive public scrutiny. Sophie thought about the photographs in Ethan's office. Community shelters. Volunteers. Families. You really care about this foundation? Ethan answered so quietly she almost missed it. It is the only thing my father left behind that still feels alive. Silence settled between them again. Different this time. Softer. Closer somehow. Sophie realized she no longer felt nervous talking to him. Strange considering less than a week ago she believed he was a struggling stranger named Edward bleeding in a train station. What? Ethan asked gently. Sophie blinked. What do you mean? You are thinking very loudly again. She laughed quietly, surprised he remembered her mother saying that. I was just trying to figure you out. Ethan lowered his voice slightly. Any success? Sophie looked down at the embroidered handkerchief still folded carefully beside her on the windowsill. E.C. Not even close. Another silence. Comfortable now. Dangerous in its comfort. Then Ethan spoke again. Tomorrow night there is a donor gala at the Palmer House. Sophie's stomach tightened immediately. That sounds horrifying. Ethan laughed softly. Probably. But I need you there. Why? Because several board members involved in the financial approvals will attend. Sophie frowned. And you want me to spy on rich people? Observe them. That sounds exactly like rich people spy language. Ethan actually laughed harder this time. The sound surprised both of them. Sophie realized she liked being the reason it happened. Very dangerous thought. You would not need to do much. Ethan continued more gently. Mostly listen. Sophie looked down at her sweater and old jeans. I do not exactly own gala clothing. Claire already arranged everything. Of course she had. Sophie shook her head slowly. This still feels unreal. Ethan's voice quieted. I know. She wondered suddenly if he felt the same way. Like their lives collided too strangely to make sense. Before she could ask, another voice interrupted faintly on his end of the phone. Female. Professional. Mr. Cole, the board is waiting. Ethan exhaled softly. I should go. Sophie nodded automatically before realizing he could not see her. Right. Another pause lingered unexpectedly. Neither of them disconnected. Finally Ethan spoke quietly. I am glad you answered the phone that day. Sophie's chest tightened so suddenly she forgot how to breathe for half a second. You mean at the station? No, he said softly. Tonight. The line disconnected before she could answer. Sophie remained standing beside the window holding the silent phone against her chest while snow drifted across downtown Chicago below. Somewhere between overdue rent notices and heated floors, something inside her life had begun changing in ways she did not fully understand yet. Behind her, Karen watched quietly from the couch with the knowing expression only mothers carried. You like him? She said softly. Sophie turned immediately. What? No. Karen smiled faintly into her tea. You are smiling at windows now. Sophie looked back toward the city lights outside and realized her mother was right. For the first time in months, maybe years, hope no longer felt dangerous. It felt possible. The next evening, the Palmer House ballroom glittered beneath enormous crystal chandeliers while Chicago's wealthiest donors drifted across polished marble floors holding champagne glasses and discussing tax strategies disguised as philanthropy. Sophie stood near the entrance trying not to panic while adjusting the dark emerald gown Claire insisted matched her eyes. She barely recognized herself. Her blonde hair fell softly over one shoulder. Subtle makeup replaced the exhaustion usually shadowing her face. Even the white coat with the bloodstain from the station had been professionally cleaned and returned to her apartment that afternoon, though she secretly kept the stain hidden near the inside sleeve untouched. A reminder. Across the ballroom, Ethan stood surrounded by board members and investors in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, while cameras flashed occasionally near the stage backdrop carrying the Cole Foundation logo. Powerful. controlled, untouchable. Yet the moment his eyes found Sophie across the crowded ballroom, something in his expression softened instantly.